You know, the following conversation is going to be probably one of the most important interviews you ever hear. And it's for a number of reasons, primarily because I want you to start to question why you believe what you believe. And in reality, by the time we're done with this conversation, you're going to realize, hey, wait a second, I've been believing somebody. Now I have to decide what is that belief based on. And, you know, we've had this guest on in the past, absolutely wonderful guest, has a wealth of information and knowledge. And I'm really looking forward to this. So we're going to be talking to Dr. Hugh Ross. He is the founder of Reasons to Believe, reasons.org. And the conversation is going to be, hey, wait a second, maybe this thing we call everything isn't by chance. Maybe there was a design behind this. So, Dr. Ross, welcome to the show, sir. How are you doing?
Doing well, thank you.
Now, I would like to start and kind of build upon this. The last time you were here, we got a lot of responses from people, and, you know, one of the questions that always comes up when you talk about a scientific stance that other people don't believe in is they always question the scientist. So let's get to you first. Let's talk about your credibility. I mean, you're not some sort of, you know, born in a church, just kind of raised up and, you know, I just believe whatever my Sunday school teacher said. You're a legitimate scientist, so give us your credentials if you could.
Well, in terms of my religious background, I really didn't get to talk to Christians until I came to Caltech after getting my PhD at the University of Toronto. So, yeah, I was born, raised, and educated in Canada, got a physics degree from the University of British Columbia, a PhD in astronomy from the University of Toronto, and then was on the faculty of Caltech as a research fellow in radio astronomy for 5 years, where I did research on quasars and galaxies.
Now, to me, that sounds pretty legitimate. When I get into discussions, we'll call them discussions, with friends, neighbors, coworkers about science, creation, the universe, all that sort of stuff, the objection comes, well, there's no real Christian scientists. There's no creation scientists. And that is just absolutely incorrect. Not only do I believe Caltech vetted you, but they typically don't give out PhDs in science to non-scientists.
Well, that's true. Moreover, when I arrived at Caltech, I met numerous astronomers there and physicists who were Christians. And they helped me. I mean, I became a Christian in Canada through reading a Gideon Bible. But it wasn't until I got to Caltech I actually met Christians. And I met them in the astronomy department. And they helped me find a church and get plugged in.
Isn't it interesting? I was talking to a biochemist who also happens to be a creationist, and I'm not even going to give his name, but it was science that led him to believe that there had to be a creator. And
well,
it seems to be the same thing with you.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, you know, I started studying astronomy when I was 7 years of age, and at age 16, spent a year looking at what we call cosmology, the origin and structure of the universe, and recognized that the Big Bang was fitting the observations better than any other explanation, and recognize if it's a Big Bang, there has to be a beginning, and if there's a beginning, there must be a beginner. And that's what launched me on looking at the different holy books that undergird the religions of the world to see if any of them comported with what I was discovering in astronomy, and was amazed to discover that in the Bible, and only in the Bible, that I find all the fundamental elements of Big Bang cosmology.
And isn't it true that throughout history there have been a number of well-respected, peer-reviewed scientists from a lot of different fields, chemistry, mathematics, all that sort of stuff, that have had their scientific discoveries lead them to a conclusion that something had to make this? I mean, it's not as if you are the rare apple and your friend at Caltech. I mean, this is fairly common in science, isn't it?
It is. Well, for example, Alan Sandage, who was Edwin Hubble's student and was probably the one most responsible for establishing that we live in an expanded universe, he spent 35 years studying the Bible, and you know, because of what he saw in science, what he saw in the Bible, he too gave his life to Jesus Christ. And surveys have been done on men and women of science, and it's about 45% believe in God and an afterlife. But what's interesting is you get a much higher percentage believing in God in the physical sciences than you do the life sciences. And I think I know why. because it tells us in the
tell
Bible.
me why.
Well, it tells us in the Bible that God created for 6 days, and he rests on the seventh day. He stops creating on day 7. And 3 places in the Bible it tells us we're still in God's seventh day. And most biologists, a vast majority, do their research in real time in the human era. And that's the era when God is resting. But, astronomers, we get all of our data from the past. So we're looking at the 6 days, and we see the handiwork of God everywhere. So I think that explains why so many of us in the physical sciences believe, because we're looking in the 6 days, and why so few in the life sciences believe, because they're looking on that day when, quote, God is at rest, resting from his work of creation.
Well, and with this first segment, and we're going to have you for the remainder of the show, but with this first segment, my point is really to establish that credibility, because so many people who are not scientists, they might be accountants or, builders, whatever. They always say, well, science has definitively shown that there's no evidence for God, and they just kind of hang their hat on that. And as a logical person, as an adult who knows how to tie my own shoes, you have to step back and say, hey, wait a second, that's a ludicrous thing to say. Science has not shown definitively that there is no evidence for God. Matter of fact, it's quite the opposite, isn't it?
It is, and this is even being recognized by those who are most opposed to the Christian faith. I mean, because of the force of the space-time theorems, you even got people like Lawrence Krauss writing in his book that, a deistic worldview of nature cannot be avoided. And, he's referring to these space-time theorems, which tell us on one condition: if the universe contains mass, that's one condition. The second condition, does general relativity provide a reliable description of movements in the bodies of the universe? If those 2 conditions are true, the theorem states there must be a beginning to space and time, which implies there must exist a causal agent beyond space and time that creates our universe of matter, energy, space, and time. So when I'm debating physicists and astronomers who refer to themselves as atheists and agnostics, they recognize there must be something, some causal agent beyond space and time that sets up the math and physics, brings the universe into existence. The real debate has shifted as to whether or not this agent, causal agent, is a personal being. And that's where the design of the universe for the benefit of human beings, I think, is a powerful tool. But it is interesting that the causal agent idea and the idea that he operates and creates outside of space and time is not a disputed item amongst people who are aware of the space-time theorems.
See, and that to most people should be revolutionary, because so many people who don't believe in something outside of us and just random chance, they hang their hat on, well, nobody really believes. And in reality, folks, did you hear what he just said? Not only are half of all scientists believers anyway, the other half is full of people who have to kind of admit, yep, something outside space and time made this. So if you're still, well, you get it by now. We'll continue right after the break. We're talking to Dr. Hugh Ross, and we're talking about real science. Now, I know that might ruffle a lot of feathers out there. Josh, I believe that science has shown that there is no God. Well, if you believe that, then you don't believe in science. I mean, let's just set some framework here. You and I are most likely not PhDs in astronomy or physics or any other sort of scientific field. However, I believe that I can think logically, and I'm hoping that as an audience member who's an adult, you can too. So let's get back to logic. We cannot say that scientists have proven there is no God. That would be an unscientific statement. I mean, just observe, hey, if half of scientists don't agree with that, then science hasn't proven it. So we've laid that framework. Now, what I would like to do in this segment, Doctor, is kind of talk about really the rest of us, me, my listeners, those who don't have PhDs in science. We really have to believe some scientists in some way when it comes to the scientific arguments. We're either going to believe people like Richard Dawkins, and I'm not going to attack him. I'm just saying, we decide to believe people like Richard Dawkins, or we decide to believe people who are like you. And for a frame of reference, Richard Dawkins has a degree in creation or evolutionary zoology, which means his entire career is based on making that puzzle piece fit. And that'd be like somebody coming into a crime scene and saying, hey, my job is to make this look like it never happened. Well, that's kind of tilted science. And then you look at scientists like you, who come from a background of not faith, but just science, and it's physicists, it's astronomers, it's chemists, it's biologists, who are all through their research, not trying to make the puzzle piece fit, letting the evidence speak for itself, and we're coming to a much different conclusion. So can you kind of expand on that a little bit?
Yeah, and for the defense of the Richard Dawkins out there, I think they're being confronted with straw man arguments, in the sense that they have a misconception of what Christianity is all about. I mean, Dawkins is very upset at these people who believe that the earth is only 6,000 years old. And he thinks that's what the Bible teaches, but it doesn't. It tells us that God created for 6 days, but if you look at the Hebrew word that's translated day, it's got 4 different literal definitions. Part of the daylight hours, all of the daylight hours, a long period of time, part of the daylight hours. So I was convinced right away at age 17, long before I met Christians, these days have to be long time periods, because it tells us that there's no evening and morning for the 7th day. It's not finished. We're still in the 7th day. It tells us that 3 times in the Bible. Also tells us that God created the human male and the human female on the 6th day. And in Genesis 2, a lot of time passes between the creation of Adam and the creation of Eve. And so once we recognize we're looking at 6 consecutive long periods of time, there's no conflict between the time scale in the biology, physics, and astronomy and the time scale we see in the Bible. And what's interesting about Dawkins, he himself recognizes the problems from a naturalistic interpretation of the history of life. I mean, he wrote on the Cambrian explosion and said these animals pop out of existence from nowhere without any evolutionary history. And he wrote that a couple of decades ago, and just a few weeks ago they found a new fossil exposure of the Cambrian explosion, confirming that indeed it is explosive. We get all these different animals just literally leaping upon the terrestrial scene, where before all we had was microscopic life. And it happens the very moment that the oxygen in the atmosphere hits the minimum level that makes possible the existence of animal life. The other thing we see is these animals show up immediately with optimized ecological relationships. You're not going to get that from a Darwinian paradigm. That's the signature of the handiwork of a creator who knows the future physics of the solar system and creates a just right life at the just right time in the maximum diversity and the maximum abundance.
And there's so much of that framework that leads you to believe, hey, wait a second, something had to create this. And in a sense, as we discover more things scientifically, these atheists or the people who are trying, and this is what it really is, they're trying to create a model where they can eliminate the possibility of something outside their own mind. So they create these models, but as scientific discoveries continue to happen, they're kind of painting themselves into a corner, aren't they? Like for example, I watched a talk you gave on dark matter, and how some of these scientists who atheists love to hang their hat on said, well, this stuff doesn't exist, because if this stuff exists, then there has to be a God. Well, newsflash, we got it.
Yeah, that happened a few years ago, where they had discovered dark energy, but they were still developing measurements to show how much of it was and whether or not this stuff really existed. But they immediately recognized that if dark energy is a significant component of the universe, it would have to be extraordinarily fine-tuned to make possible the existence of life. In fact, if you were asked to ask me as a scientist, where do we find the most spectacular, measurable evidence for fine-tuning design, it would be the quantity of dark energy that's necessary in order to get galaxies, planets, and stars so life would be possible. And there were three theoretical physicists who took an atheistic worldview perspective who wrote on this and said, if dark energy is real, then there must be an agent outside of space and time that's performing miracles for reasons of his own. And the title of their paper was Disturbing Implications of a Cosmological Constant, which is another term for dark energy. And they actually closed their paper out by saying, perhaps dark energy is not real. But what the irony was, just a few months later, astronomers came up with 9 independent observational demonstrations that not only is dark energy real, it makes up about 3/4 of all the stuff of the universe, which means we really are stuck with an agent beyond space and time who's performing miracles for reasons of his own.
And here's, again, what it boils down to. We're not having a scientific symposium here. I understand wholeheartedly that most of my audience is just made up of laymen like myself. But you have to start looking at this stuff and saying, hey, wait a second. The floor that these scientists were standing on, saying that there can never be evidence that there's a God, that floor is eroding fast. So can you kind of give us some examples of different areas of science, like something from biology and then something from astronomy, just kind of different areas of science that kind of lend credence to this idea that there is a creator?
Yeah, one of the more dramatic examples would be the origin of life. In fact, we just released a new edition of our book called Origins of Life. And, we've been attending, I say we, our staff biochemist, Fuzz Rana, and myself, have been attending Origin of Life research conferences. And what's interesting is they look at planet Earth and say, we've got evidence, physical evidence and chemical evidence, that planet Earth never had the building blocks that are necessary to make the proteins, the DNA, and the RNA. The chemical conditions of planet Earth simply wouldn't permit it. Moreover, they really did exist, these prebiotic molecules. We would see a certain isotope signature in the carbon and the sulfur and the nitrogen, and we don't. So it establishes that Earth never had these prebiotics. Moreover, a physicist jumped in and said, well, if you've got oxygen in the early Earth's environment, that will prevent any assembly of these building block molecules. But if you don't have oxygen, then there's nothing to stop the ultraviolet radiation streaming in from the sun, and that's just as catastrophic to prebiotic chemistry as the existence of oxygen. It's called the oxygen ultraviolet paradox. If you got oxygen, you can't get the building blocks. If you don't have oxygen, you can't get the building blocks. Moreover, we know that the life originated very quickly on planet Earth, and the bottom line is if you got no building blocks and little or no time, you got no possible naturalistic explanation for the origin of life.
Well, Doctor, hold on a second. We're up against another break, but that book, Origins of Life, a lot of people have read it from different backgrounds, and a lot of people are saying, wow, this is kind of groundbreaking work. So let's talk a little bit about that book when we come back. We're talking to Dr. Hugh Ross. Now, folks, I understand in a radio show we do not have time to delve into everything. This is why you need to go to the website. You don't send me an email, well, Josh, you didn't cover it. Well, of course I didn't cover it. I only have a 2-hour show. So go to the website, reasons.org. There are 1,564 plus articles. There's tons of books, tons of videos. There's even a course. For goodness sakes, you can take a 30-week course in this and figure out, hey, wait a second, maybe all these other scientists were just emotional. And Doctor, we're getting back into this book that you guys have that has just gotten rave reviews from people across the scientific spectrum, Origins of Life. Can you tell us about this book?
Yeah, we just released it 2 weeks ago. It's an update of a book we released in 2004, so the new book contains links to literally hundreds of articles that Fuzz and I have written, and we're committed to keep you updated in the very latest on the origin of life. So if you go to our website at reasons.org, you'll actually see the Josh Tolley Show button, and you can click on that. You'll get a free download of my story of how science brought me to faith in Christ. But if you actually mention Josh Tolley when you place an order for the book, a gift of any amount, you'll get a copy of the book, Origins of Life.
Oh, cool.
And my staff just popped in the door and said we're going to do that for your listeners. So they can take advantage of that. Just mention Josh Tolley, and they'll let them buy the book for a gift of any amount. And interestingly, the book was actually reviewed by David Deamer. He's one of the leading origin of life researchers. Told us he takes a non-theistic worldview, but he reviewed our book in the journal Origins of Life and the Biosphere, and basically said that our book was the most extensive and comprehensive scientific review of the origin of life. And he told us privately he likes everything about the book except the Jesus Christ part. But you can read the review. He knows we're Christians, knows our perspective, but he says you've been very honest about the state of the scientific situation and the dilemma that we have in trying to explain the origin of life from a naturalistic perspective. And I think what excites us about this brand new edition, as tough as it was back in 2004 for people who took a non-theistic perspective, the evidence is making it far more challenging than it was before, and I really see no way out. I mean, if you got no building blocks and you got little or no time, you've got no naturalistic model. In fact, I can tell you this: we were at the Origin of Life research conference. It was a 4-day conference. And I remember at the very end, the scientists came to the question and answer microphone and said, on day 1 of the conference, we eliminated Earth as a candidate for the origin of life. Then we eliminated on day 2 Mars. On day 3, we eliminated all the rest of the solar system bodies. On day 4, we eliminated the idea that there could be a rock or a piece of dust that brought life to planet Earth. He says the only option left is that aliens from another planet built a spaceship and brought life here to planet Earth 3.8 billion years ago. And I remember talking to Fuzz when he said that and saying he's getting close to the right answer. It is an alien, but not from another planet. It's an alien from beyond, matter, energy, space, and time. And, one scientist just jumped up and said, no, wait a minute. We know you can't have intelligent life until the universe is nearly 14 billion years old. So there's no way physical beings like us 3.8 billion years ago could have brought life to planet Earth. You really are left with just one option, namely the God of the Bible.
And see, that's the point that I really want to get across, because if I was in a room full of scientists, I can guarantee you I wouldn't be able to keep up. But what it comes down to is there are so many people out there who are just believing faulty or old science. They're claiming, well, I believe in science. But in reality, they're just emotionally believing in some sort of scientist that wants to present a case against real science. Because, like it or not, folks, the science is in. The real science, the observable, the replicatable, the whatever sort of marker you want to use to judge quote-unquote science, that's moving away from, oh, this is just random chance. And even as the doctor just suggested, even people who don't want to believe that there was a deity are left with the conclusion of, scientifically, something else had to make this. So if you're still one of those accountants who are hanging on to, well, science doesn't, all you're really doing is showing that you're an idiot. And of course, the good doctor's not going to say that, but I'm a little bit harsher because I'm a realist. You cannot, as an adult human being, act like that and say, well, scientifically speaking, because it just shows you know absolutely nothing about science. So, doctor, I guess that's a little harsh, but I'm just so sick and tired of people wanting to be logical in their real world. Well, Josh, when it comes to politics, we have to be logical. Or, Josh, when it comes to social issues, we have to be logical. Well, if we're logical about science, then you'd be realizing that everybody and their brother in the scientific community is either A, on board with there's a deity, or B, trying to get around the fact that, wait a second, there's a deity in the room. How do we get around it? And that's really what scientists have come down to.
Yeah, I think the problem is most people aren't exposed to the most potent evidence for the God of the Bible. It's the origin of the universe, the origin of life, the origin of human beings, and the design of the universe, Earth, and its long history of life that makes possible not only humanity, but humans with a capacity to launch and sustain global civilization. I talk to people on the science-faith issues. They're usually talking about science that's outside those areas. So I think we who are believers need to bring people back to the most potent evidence that they probably have never heard.
Well, exactly. And I'm gonna ask you a question in 1 second about evidence versus proof. But just to kind of sum up what my little rant that I was on, if you don't want to believe in God, that's absolutely fine. But you can no longer say that scientifically speaking, that's why you don't believe in God. You have to at least be mature enough and scientific enough to admit that that in itself is not cause to say there is no God. So let's kind of talk about evidence versus proof. I mean, there are some people who are, well, unless you put God in a bottle and bring him into this room, I'm never going to believe you. And of course, that's very unscientific, very immature. But there are people with that sort of view. Can you kind of address that?
Yes, I mean, I remember years ago I spoke at a group called Atheists United. There were 300 atheists in the room, and I just asked them a question before I started speaking. How many of you would be prepared to commit your life to the God of the Bible if you saw adequate scientific evidence for that God? And, a third of the people said, we're not going to believe until we see absolute proof. We're not going to believe until all the gaps of scientific knowledge have been filled. And I said, well, that'll never happen. There'll always be stuff that we don't know. And I said, we need to judge the existence of God and what we do know and what happens when we learn more and more. Does the evidence become more compelling as we learn more or less compelling? But the bottom line is, if you're demanding absolute proof, you can't provide that. In fact, I told the audience, look, I've been married to my wife for more than 30 years, but I still do not have absolute proof that she exists. All I've got is a high probability based on numerous experiments and observations. But the point is that evidence has gotten a lot stronger. And I would say as a scientist that I'm more confident based on scientific evidence in the existence of God, the God of the Bible, than I am my own existence or the existence of any member of my family. It's that compelling. But it's still not absolute. Not absolute in the sense that we have yet to discover everything there is to discover about the universe. I mean, like with my wife, there's still stuff I'm discovering about her that I didn't know was there in the first place. But the point is, we test based on what happens to our gaps of knowledge. If from a worldview perspective, the gaps are getting smaller and less numerous and less problematic, then that's good news for our model. But if it's going the other way, for example, what we saw happen with the origin of life, how from a non-theistic perspective, the gaps are getting bigger, more numerous, and more problematic, those are all scientific signs you got the wrong model.
Well, and that's a great example. When I was thinking about this interview today, I was actually driving into the studio thinking about evidence versus proof. And this is like saying, you have a little kid and there's footprints going into the kitchen, and you say, oh, well, no, that's not proof of anything. And then there's a little handprint on the cookie jar. No, that's not proof of anything. And the cookies are missing. No, that's not proof of anything. We wouldn't act this way in any other part of life. But when it comes to this, we are still at this point, at least a lot of us, and we're saying, well, I don't want to believe in the mounting evidence. And when we come back, how mounting is this evidence? Wait until you hear the odds that this man is wrong. I mean, it is just, you'd have to be, well, I don't want to call everybody an idiot again, but you get the point. It's out of love. Calm down. Don't send me hate mail. We'll be back right after this.